Good afternoon, everyone, and you're all very welcome to the latest Radio Centre Ireland webinar. And this webinar is on the Irish audio market. And I very much like to welcome Karen Hall from Ipsos, who will be going through the findings of the research shortly. And the audio market report is it kind of supplements its additional research to the Jane Lore, and it looks at kind of the broader audio landscape in Ireland. So looking at things like obviously radio, but also streaming and podcasts and where people access audio and how they access it. So it's kind of a broader piece of research compared to the Jane Lore. But before Karen delves into the research, I am briefly just going to recap some very simple kind of stats on the Jane Lore itself. And then I'll hand over to Karen and she'll talk through technology and how that's enabling access to audio, looking at the daily audio environment and the overall audio market. And then if there's any questions people have, if you use the Q&A or the chat button and ask any questions along the way, we'll answer them right at the end. So firstly, and I know probably everybody on the webinar knows these figures because we talk about it quite a lot. But they are quite phenomenal when you think about it, that 79, nearly 8% of all adults listen to radio every single day. And on average, they listen for 4 hours and 20 minutes. So if you add up the 4 hours 20 multiplied by the 80% of the population, you're looking at 13.6 million hours of radio listened every single day. So it is quite phenomenal. And sometimes we get used to those figures. They are actually phenomenal figures. I think another way of expressing this in a very simple way, I think, is just showing a visual of 100 people, and the green people represent the daily reach of radio. So nearly 80 out of 100 people are tuning in and listening to radio every day, and that very much dwarfs the figures, surprisingly, that you would get from the tech companies. And Ipsos, separately to this piece of research, have also done some social media tracking research. And if you look at radio there, it has 79 out of 100 people tuning to radio every day. The comparative figure for Facebook is only 34 out of 100. For Instagram, it's 30 out of 100 tuning in or using it on a daily basis. For Twitter, it's 10. For LinkedIn, it's 7. And for Pinterest, it's 1 out of 100. So you can see how radio really dwarfs those tech companies in terms of the amount of people using the medium every single day. And again, what might be surprising as well, the number of people has actually grown over time. So if you look at the chart there going back to 2018, the number of people tuning into radio every day, 3138, and that's increased in 2022. Now, you may say the population has increased as well, which is true, but the radio listening and daily reach has grown in line with the population as well. So you're looking at more people listening to radio every day. And it really means that radio persists at the core of daily life in Ireland. And not just amongst all adults, which is obviously the figure I shared earlier, 79%, but even the 15 to 24-year-old audience, which you would see as the bullseye for lots of other services within audio, 2/3 of them are also tuning in to radio every single day. And also still, radio is still being consumed mainly through FM, and Karen will go into more details on this shortly. You can see for all adults, it's 90% through FM, 10% through a digital device. For 50 to 34-year-olds, the balance is a little bit different, with 19% accessing content through a digital device. So that very briefly is just a recap and a summary of the Jane Lore. And I'm going to hand over to Karen, who's going to go through details about the audio market report.
Thanks, Kieran. If I'll just share my screen. Okay, so as Kieran briefly mentioned there, the audio module is a particular aspect of JNLR that we conduct every year. So typically what we do is for one quarter of the year, usually April to June, we expand the core JNLR interview to include some additional questions on the broader audio market. So this particular survey, that means it was running for 3 months of the year, which is a good spread of time, and that we conducted, it was a large sample. We conducted over 3,100 interviews in that time on this audio module. And remember, it is a face-to-face interview, so of course that means that all ages, all regions are included in the sample, as well as all those people who are online, who tend to be online, and those people who tend to be offline to a greater degree. So it's a broad sample across the whole country. So that's just to remind us, you know, how we conduct this audio module information. So the first aspect that we're going to look at is in terms of the technology that people have. And this really is shown here to set the scene, almost to let us know how much technology people have, and how that might facilitate them in the audio market, and indeed in visual content markets as well. So we can see now at currently 88% of people say they have broadband access. 90% own a smartphone, and that increases even to a higher number among the younger markets, where it's almost universal at 99% among the 15-34s. 70% own a tablet device, and 40% now own voice-enabled technology, and that has grown to quite rapidly over the last number of years. We included a question in terms of online TV service such as Netflix and Disney's, and this really is to, I suppose, it is very much one of those new technologies over the past number of years, but it also gives us a little bit of an insight into the competitive visual content market as well. And we can see that now 75% of people would have an online TV service subscriptions. So how does that look in terms of the trend of information? So broadly, when we look at smartphones, in 2018, 82% of the population owned a smartphone, and it's now increased to 90%. So almost at saturation level at this point. Tablet device is the ownership levels has been pretty steady across that period of time. But when we look at voice activated technology, we can see the rapid increase there. And by voice activated technology, we asked people specifically, or we prompted people with examples such as Alexa or Google Home and the likes of those. So we can see that in 2018, 11% of people had one of these devices, and that's now grown to 40% of people. And also on the online TV service, more rapid growth there as well, from a 57% base to a 75% base. So that kind of sets the scene. And we can see, you know, with this level of ownership of particularly smartphones, we can see now that this facilitates listening to audio content anywhere. You don't need to be at home necessarily. You can be out and about to access your content. So when we look at that daily environment, in other words, where were people, where were they listening in terms of their daily life, in terms of an average day, we can see that irrespective of any audio format, whether it's radio or podcasting or streaming, 74% of people still listen to audio content at home. So it's very much an in-home kind of content. But 39% say they listened to audio in the car. 67% use a radio or a music player to listen. And 34% are now using a smartphone to listen. That's tuning in irrespective of time spent on particular formats. So if we look at that in a little bit more detail in terms of the device used on an average day, as I said, the radio or the music device is still the biggest device used, followed by smartphone. 9% then use a smart speaker to listen to audio. 9% use a laptop or a PC. 5% use a tablet device, and only 3% use a TV to listen. So the growth there in terms of the last time we presented this information, we do see some growth in the use of smartphones. At the last report, it was 28%. And we do see some growth in the use of smart speakers. It was previously at 6% and now at 9%. So there is growth in those technologies. But still in all, the most used device is the radio or the music player. And that, as you will see in a later chart, is because the biggest audio content is still radio. Where were people listening? And we can see, as we said in the summary, 3/4 of people are listening at home, 39% are in the car, 11% are at work, school or college, and 9% are listening when they're out walking or cycling or running, 2% on a bus, train and DART. That changes slightly among the younger markets. For example, we would see higher levels at work, school or college, or when out walking and cycling, but only marginally higher. Still, the main trend is across all formats and across all ages that most people are listening at home. You might think that the 2% on the bus, train and DART is quite small, but we do have to keep in mind, how people get around, how people commute, how people, move around the place. We did include a question last year on that mode of transport, and we found that 82% of the sample are getting around by car and only 6% by public transport. Now that increases slightly if you're in Dublin, it increases to 12%, and it increases slightly among younger people, it increases to 9%. So not everybody is commuting and getting around on buses or trains or DARTs. Most people are still moving around by car, and that will explain, I suppose, the relatively high proportion of people who are tuning in and are listening in the car to audio activity. It's more or less unchanged since we last looked at this. Like the at-home figure last year was at 75%. Slight increase in the in-car figure compared to the last report. That could be down to us moving out of the restricted kind of situations we were experiencing with COVID, when more people were working from home and so on. If we look at specific audiences to specific formats, we can see that radio is still the biggest format in the in-car environment. We can see that among the music streaming audience, 19% of that audience were listening when they're out walking or cycling and running. So it is something that these other competitive formats are being used when people are out and about to a degree. And similarly, among podcast audiences, while still the vast majority are listening at home, 15% of people who of that audience are listening as they're out walking and cycling and so on. So it's quite interesting findings in that regard. So that's broadly the environment in which people are listening and the devices that they're using to listen. And now we're going to look specifically at the audio market itself. And in this section, we're going to see how audiences are behaving in the market and how many people are listening to various audio formats. So briefly and broadly, we can see that the vast majority of the population, so 88.7% of the population, are active in the audio market every day, irrespective of what format of audio that they're listening to. So that equates to 3.6 million daily active audio listeners. So it's a huge number again. And when we expand that out and look in terms of the past week, it's almost universal listening. 97% of people are listening in the past week to some form of audio content. Again, a huge number. So people are very engaged in this particular market. It is obviously a competitive market, and in this environment, this competitive environment, we can see that radio still is in a prominent position. 90% are listening to live radio weekly, and that compares to 58.1% who listen to on-demand online audio weekly. So when we say on demand online, what we're talking about everything except radio and our own music archives, like our CDs or vinyls or digital tracks and so on. So while the online element is growing, at last report it was 53%. It's still, the gap there is still quite a rather large gap. So we can still see that radio is still in the prime position in regards to radio or audio activity on a weekly basis. So when we look more broadly at that market and we look at the individual formats, and again, we're talking about weekly listening. As we saw, 90% are listening to live radio, 40% are listen to music streaming on a weekly basis, 35% to YouTube for music, 18% to their own music archives. As I said, that means, you know, the CDs, the vinyls, the digital tracks. 6% to listen to playback radio. 23% are listening to podcasts. So it is a competitive space, obviously, and there is a lot of activity in the on-demand market, but it's still dwarfed by live radio. This analysis here talks about listening irrespective of time spent listening, whether somebody spent, you know, 3 hours or 3 minutes. Everyone's counted on this particular chart. What is interesting to do is then to look at the trend over time. So we can see here we've got reports going back from 2018 to the current 2022, and we can see that radio is currently at 90%. It is showing a small decline, but it's a relatively slow decline, if you want to say that. And as we say, almost universal listening, still listening to live radio. When we look at music streaming, we can see a relatively rapid increase. You know, we in 2018 it was at 22% listened on a weekly basis, and it's now at 40%. But this relatively rapid growth, as we can see, isn't necessarily at the expense of radio listening. It's more supplanting our own music archives, because if we go down a couple of lines and look at our own music and the figures for that, we see that in 2018 it was at 38% and it's now at 18%. So it's dropped by 20 percentage points, whereas music streaming is increasing by almost the same proportion. So we can see that with new technology and the pace of new technology, that the new technology enables us to do away with our old ways of listening to our own music. You know, you don't need your CD player anymore. You don't need your record player. You know, you don't need your iPod anymore. You can do a lot of this stuff by streaming your music, and that's what's happening here. So the relatively rapid growth in streaming isn't necessarily at the expense of radio. It's more replacing our old ways of listening to our own music. The other thing that's rapidly growing here, as you can see, is in terms of podcasting. So in 2019, when we first benchmarked this, we saw that 9% of people podcasted on a weekly basis, and that's now stands at 23%. So again, that's something that, you know, technology has had a rapid impact on this area in the last number of years, and more people are listening in to podcasts now than they were previously. If we were to look at that in terms of the various age cohorts here, we can see that live radio is still hugely important across all age groups. So while we're at 90% at the 15 plus level, we see that even among the younger groups, the 15 to 24s, 85% of these people still listen to live radio. Listen back at 6%. Music streaming, then there's a much higher proportion of the younger group, the 15 to 24-year-olds, are tuning in to something like Spotify or another streaming service on a weekly basis. And then it goes among the 25 to 44-year-olds, 52%, still higher than average, but much less than the 15 to 24-year-olds. we see it tailing off then as the age groups get older. Again, YouTube for music is much higher among the 15 to 24-year-olds than among the rest of the population, and that's probably not particularly surprising there. Any podcast, so any listening at all to podcasts stands at 23% currently. Again, higher among the younger age groups. But 17% of people say they listen to an Irish podcast, and 14% say they listen to an international podcast. So there's obviously some crossover between those two items, where many people are listening to both Irish podcasts and international podcasts. And again, as we saw a reasonably rapid growth in terms of the podcasting activity. What are people tuning into when they are listening to those podcasts? So the main genre of podcasts listened to is music, and 33% say, this is now among podcast weekly listeners, 33% say they're listening to a podcast that is in some way related to music content, followed quickly by comedy at 31%, documentaries at 28%, sport at 28%, and news and politics at 26%. So they're the top 5 genres. Now, following closely behind that, we see current affairs at 24%, health and well-being at 19%, entertainment, things about movies or radio or TV and so on at 18%. And true crime even is mentioned at 17%. So in terms of sport, is very much like a domain among males, that there's many more men who say they were tuning into sport. So that's probably not particularly surprising. Music, more than average, mentioned among the younger individuals. Whereas news and politics and documentaries tend to be there's higher than average listening to those genres among older groups. When we look at health and well-being health and well-being or lifestyle type of genres, more women than men would be tuning into those type of genres. So probably falls out the way you might anticipate that it would. But overall, remember that almost a quarter of the population are listening to a podcast on a weekly basis. Almost half of those, 49%, are aged between 25 to 44. And the vast majority of those people who are listening are people who are working individuals. So the next part of the presentation, we're looking at the daily picture and how people are behaving in the marketplace on an everyday basis. And I suppose this allows us to compare and contrast more easily with JNLR, because as we know, the daily environment is one of particular importance to JNLR, and they are the metrics that we report very, very often on JNLR. So we're going to look at that next. So, while many people are tuning into on-demand online radio, in terms of the time they actually spend listening, live radio still commands the majority share, the vast majority of the share, with 74.3% of all time spent on audio is to live radio. I think this probably best reflects, radio as still a very easily accessible format, an engaging format, and in some ways an undemanding format. You don't actually have to do anything. You switch on and then somebody else is choosing the music that you might listen to. And that element of surprise is still there with radio. Other research that we've often done in this area, people like the not knowing what's coming next. Oh, listen, that song, I love that song. That little bit of surprise is still there. So I think those kind of aspects are still behind the big number that we see here. That still it's easy to have radio on in the background. still most time spent is to radio. So 74% to radio, 12% of all time to music streaming, 2.5% to our own music archives, 3.8% to podcasting, and 6.5% to YouTube for music. Now that'll obviously change when we look at the younger age markets, and we will see that shortly in terms of share. Looking back at what we would typically consider to be the reach figure and the daily reach, we can see here, if we're looking at the left-hand section of the screen here, we're looking at the all adults market, the 15 plus market. And we can see here that in terms of reach, radio is still on a daily basis, live radio still reaches 76% of the population. So it's still the number one choice by a significant margin. 29% on a daily basis are listening to music streaming, 19% to YouTube for music, 6% to our own archives, and 10% now to podcasting on a daily basis, 2% to listen back to Irish radio. As Kieran mentioned earlier on, the 15-24-year-old is an often commented upon market and group. So we've pulled out the analysis for that particular segment of the market. And we can see here that in terms of reach, so listening irrespective of time spent, that 66% of this market listen to a music streaming service. 62% are listening to live radio, much higher than average are listening to YouTube for music as well. So it is a very competitive environment particularly among those younger age groups. But irrespective of what they're tuning into on an average day and the pure numbers of people who are tuning in, even among that young age segment, when we come to time spent, radio is still the number one format across all of the various age groups. 74% 15 plus, 42% 15 to 24s, rising to 67% again among the 25 to 44-year-olds, 84% among 45 to 64-year-olds, and 95% among the older 65 plus group. So it's still the number one format in terms of time spent. When we look at music streaming at 12.2%, we do see that now among the 15-24-year-olds, that music streaming has a 33.7% share of the audio market now. So it's second behind radio among this very competitive subgroup of the population. 15% share among the 25 to 44-year-olds. We can see YouTube for music as well. Very much the share for that is highest among those 15 to 24-year age groups. So following the patterns that we saw in terms of reach, it's reflecting here in terms of share of time spent, but not to the same level. So irrespective of time spent, we still see that radio is the number one format across all of those audio formats. The final chart really is more in terms of a summary of what we've just seen. So we know from JNLR that radio's reach and engagement with audience, it ensures its prominent position in this particular sector. And it does, I believe, keep it very relevant for the future as well. We know that Irish audiences are very connected in this digital world. We see that ownership of smartphones is now at 90% and smart speakers at 40%. And this is enabling easy access to audio content at home or out and about anywhere. We see that most listening to audio is still happening at home. 3 in every 4 individuals listened to audio at home yesterday on a typical or average day, and 39% while driving or being driven in a car. So live radio is still the biggest format in the car environment. we see in terms of the broader audio market, you know, it's almost universal weekly engagement and listening in this market among the population. You know, 97% of people tuning in to some audio content. So that's a huge boost to the radio industry, and particularly as well. And live radio is the dominant player here, reaching 90% of adults weekly. We see that on-demand online is growing, and it now stands at 58%, but there's still a huge gap there between radio and on-demand. And furthermore, we saw that growth in on-demand online is not necessarily at the expense of radio. It's not at all at the expense of radio. It's more supplanting the old ways we had of listening to our own music. You know, as we said, you know, most people aren't listening to CDs anymore, or to their vinyl, even though we know vinyl is having a little bit of a renaissance. So technology is enabling us to just change the way we're listening to our own music archives. And to remember that live radio currently still has, in this audio market, a share of 74.3% of the audio market. So it does, I believe, reflect the engaging, accessible and free format that radio is for listeners. And while we see that many people are tuning into on-demand audio, you know, the amount of time they spend is less. So they might be streaming every day. There's more people streaming every day. There's more people podcasting every day. But it's not the kind of format that they're spending as much time with as they are with radio. So they're the broad findings of this particular study. I'm open to any questions if anybody has any questions they want to ask.
Many thanks, Karen. I have some questions on the chat box. So actually, there's one question for you, one question for me. So I'll start with the one for you, Karen, which is, given the amount of time spent listening to streamers, is music streaming taking a greater share of total listening now, especially with younger adults? I know you kind of addressed that. I think that was earlier in the presentation. You had a few charts on it later on, but you might just answer that.
Yeah. Well, we see that, you know, the more and more people are tuning in, particularly among those younger people, to on-demand audio. When we ask them, though, how much time they spend, we still see that that they're spending more time with radio. The total pie, you know, of listening to audio isn't necessarily growing. Like, people aren't adding extra things into the audio pie. So while we do see the proportion for radio at 74%. Sorry, let me just go back to the proper chart. We do see the proportion at 74.3%. Now that is a slight decrease compared to last year. So online on demand is taking a little bit away, but it's primarily, it seems, taking away from our own music archives, you know, whether they be CDs or digital and so on.
Pretty good. Another question from Barry Judy. Hi, Barry. It's the both of us. It was a great presentation. The figures of radio that you highlighted at the beginning seem to be exceptionally healthy when you compare these to other platforms mentioned. My query relates to media planning recommendations to advertisers from their agencies. Do you know, or does the radio industry know, is maybe getting a fair representation on schedules in terms of share, volume, and spend? Is there any evidence that the agency planners are taking this useful data on board when developing recommendations for their clients and advertisers? I think there's a couple of areas there. I think firstly, for the first time, we've actually measured the radio sector, because up until this year, there wasn't a proper accurate measure of the total revenue for the sector. There was, you know, estimates coming from the agency world, but it was difficult to measure, because when you add in branded solutions, spot advertising, digital audio, direct advertisers, as well as agencies, it was difficult to get an accurate figure. We now have one. Last year's 145 million, which represents on an estimated 12.7% share of the total advertising market. So it's relatively healthy. It is healthy compared to some other markets in other countries, but not as healthy as some markets in Europe have a higher share. And I do think there is opportunities for agencies and clients to spend more in the medium. I do think there is a little bit, there's research done on this in the UK. We're looking at doing it in Ireland, but we haven't got it done yet. This kind of unconscious bias. And I know IAPI have looked at this area in particular, and people sometimes may plan based on their own media experiences and not necessarily on the total population. So I do think there is huge opportunities to grow share. And quite interesting, there was a webinar last Wednesday, which I know a lot of people are on, with Karen Elsa Fields and Peter Pinter talking about how does advertising work, and particularly measuring attention. I thought it was a really interesting stat that Karen shared. It was that 85% of all viewed impressions on digital are viewed for 2.3 seconds or less. So my argument would be, it is such a small window of time to communicate your brand story. There's probably greater opportunities to that on a medium like radio, which has less obstacles to attention because there's no scrolling and etc. So I do think, the share is healthy, but I think there's great opportunities to grow it even more. There's a few more questions I'll just go through on the chat. Interesting that respondents say their top genre of podcast is music, but there are very few music-related podcasts available, and other data doesn't concur with this. Are they mistaking podcasts for music streaming or music downloading, e.g. the old iPod behavior? Karen, if you want to
it was a specific question in terms of the type of podcast they were listening. So we were very much focused on podcasting. So I don't think necessarily they're mistaken. Perhaps it's more podcasting in terms of information about, I don't know what, I don't have detail apart from the broad music idea there. So I don't know if it's about bands or if it's about new music or what it might be, but I don't think they're necessarily mistaking it for streaming. No, because the question was specifically focused on podcasts. So in terms of it not matching other information that we know, I'm not sure on that really. As to why that might be. Do you have any thoughts?
The overall podcast share is still, it is relatively low. Is the total share? I think it's
total share.
3.8% of total.
Total share of time is 3.8%, and we know that 23% are listening on a weekly basis. So it is still a very small. It's a very small proportion of people who are listening in, and I suppose their interests will vary greatly.
Brilliant.
It is a prompted question now. That question was in terms of genre of podcast. The various genres were prompted in terms of a show card, to the particular individuals.
Okay, great, Carol. Another question from Siobhan Gavin. Hi, Siobhan. Thanks for the informative update. Is there any further visibility on the at-home listening figures, and has the trend changed somewhat on what time of the day people are tuning in to live radio?
We didn't have the opportunity to measure location in terms of time of what part of the day they were listening. It was that it wasn't connected to a time grid, for example. So basically the question just asked about, when you were listening yesterday, where were you? Where were you at that time? Were you at home, at work, or whatever? So we don't have a huge sense of visibility around what times of the day that would be. But I mean, we do know, obviously with radio, we know that their major peak times are for listening. We don't have a comparative in terms of the other audio formats as to when they peak. Are they more likely to be listened to in the evening, for example, than in the morning? So unfortunately, we don't have that visibility in this particular survey.
The Jane the law that's coming out in a few weeks would have that data extracted in terms of live radio, wouldn't it? She'd be able to work out?
We don't on JNLR anymore. We don't have location. What we have instead is platform and device in terms of actual time. Yeah.
I think that is all the questions. I suppose just one question from me, Karen, to you. Just, is there anything that surprised you in the latest, looking at the audio market? Is there anything that kind of jumped out at you that was a bit surprising and not expected?
Is it not that it's surprising in a way, and you touched on this already, Kieran, in this trend and the steady trend for radio over time. It's still remarkable that number of people are tuning into this format, and that always it does still surprise me, that so many people are engaged in radio in this competitive environment, and I think that is a great outcome for radio. So the pace of change, I suppose, in terms of people switching, listening to those other formats, it's not surprising that it's the younger people who, I suppose, where we see the change happening at a slightly faster pace. So no, I suppose it's I suppose gratifying, that for this market, that radio is still as strong as it is. Yeah.
Brilliant. Many thanks, everybody. I think that is, I'll just double check. I think there is might be one more question. Just bear with me. There is whether on Lee Thompson, hi Lee, whether on demand or live radio, is there evidence to suggest more minutes overall are being spent with audio?
It's not really. If anything, it's very marginal. As we said, I think people have a finite amount of time, I suppose, in their day for any of this, for accessing this type of content. So it might be up 2 or 3 minutes, but that would be all it would be in time. So the pie of minutes, I suppose, is the amount. The pie of minutes is pretty steady. So the amount of time that people are devoting isn't really changing. So as new formats come on, it's not necessarily that people are going to be listening more and more, because remember, again, it's also in an environment where all that other content is available, video content and the TV and even social media and so on. So I don't think the pie of time, if we call it that, is growing necessarily. It's just things are shifting, some more marginal than others within that pie.
Great, many thanks. I think that is all the questions we have. Just to let you know, the deck, and there's an appendix to it with lots more detail, will be available on the website this afternoon. And there'll be a link on the Radio Centre Ireland newsletter that will be going out this afternoon, and a recording of the webinar. And also, similarly, last Wednesday's webinar on attention will also be on the website, including the presentations and the recording of the webinar. So the newsletter will go out later on today with those links. So many thanks to everybody for your time and attention. Really appreciate it, and see you all soon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.